Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. So we've had some very good and interesting discussions so far this morning, and already some of the discussions outside on the booth and with some of the interviews, we're asking some key questions around what has the Internet of Things got to do with smart cities? And I guess I'm lucky in a way because actually that's what my session is about. And what I'm going to try and explore within this is, firstly, just level set ourselves on smart cities and what do we mean by that, and then how does the Internet of Things, why is it fundamentally important for smart cities, and how do we use it? Ultimately, there are a lot of great technology companies outside. What's important is what do we do with that technology? How do we use it to improve the standard of living for people, for businesses, and visitors to anywhere we'd like to go? And we're quite selective in using the term smarter cities. And I'll come to that very shortly when we start looking at definitions of smart cities. I was on a panel last week and the moderator asked the question, I see many definitions for smart cities. Which one is right? What's the way to go? Everyone's got a different opinion and is not wrong. So in terms of just to share with you from the standards bodies, there's various views. So British Standards, BSI, has a view about smart cities. I'm not going to read them all. You can read them and the slides will be available afterwards. But it's about, even within standards bodies, there's different opinions about that. The ITU has a definition for smart cities. Just for disclosure purposes, Huawei is part of the working group within ITU for smart sustainable communities. The last session was in Abu Dhabi last month, and we're discussing a number of the topics and starting to look at IoT as well. And then ISO has even a longer view about what it means to be smart cities, but generally you'll find within there someone will talk about technology somehow. Actually, the way we like to think about smart cities is based on this hypothesis, which I'll put to you, which is that smart city really refers to a program of work. It's about improving the city in some way, shape, or form in a structured program. And that's why no two cities need to be the same. And that's why what's important for one city in the world is not necessarily the priority somewhere else, because they're working on a vision. And within Dubai, we're very fortunate that His Excellency has set out a very clear vision. That translates into a strategic program of work. That program of work can contain multiple projects. Everything from building real infrastructure like roads and bridges through to things which are better connected with technology and some things which you wouldn't be able to achieve without technology. So when we look at why, which is another key question that people like to ask me about, why is smart cities important? Why are we doing it? It's a very good question. This is a selection of some output from a piece of work that we commissioned with IDC for some research around smart cities last year. And one of the key findings was that not only are there more cities, but also the size of those cities is increasing. And by definition, a megacity is a city with more than 10 million population, and the number of those has trebled within the last 24 years. So you've got large concentrations of people all requiring basic services and all having higher expectations every day. Within the Middle East, what does that mean? It's very important within Huawei at least that we don't think that just because something happens in the US or in Europe, we need to, or even in China, that we just need to implant that in another region. It's not the case. We look at what's important within the region. And within this region, there's some key factors. A transient population. I believe the figures for people visiting Dubai last year were over 13 million. And that's people staying overnight. That's one part of transient population. The other is a lot of us in this room who are here for a longer time, but ultimately we're not really from here. And we will go eventually at some point. Economic diversification. I think that's pretty clear that economies within the region are looking to change. And part of that change requires the ability to innovate And I'll come back to the theme of innovation later on, and how do we use the Internet of Things in enabling innovation. Regional security, I think that's pretty obvious and doesn't require any more depth. And then youth population. Sometimes people think of the youth population as a challenge, and it is in a way, but it's also a great opportunity. Because when you want to do things using technology, the younger people, the younger population will adopt that technology a lot faster than an older generation, maybe like me. Take a little bit more time. So youth population can be used to an advantage, and it's about engaging and delivering service to that youth population in a way that they want to consume it. For example, maybe you don't want to go down to the center of town and wait at an office all day and then come back tomorrow because the tickets ran out for today. Maybe you want to be able to access that service electronically through your mobile device or through another device, and this is what we'll come back to. Within Huawei, we tend to look at the smart city program development in 3 mega waves. And generally, when we look at projects, they tend to fall into one of these categories, which is either it has an infrastructure focus and it's about modernization, or we find cities that are focused on improving services as their priority or their theme of their program. And some are focused on innovation. Now, that doesn't mean that a smart city program focused on innovation and mobile services, for example, doesn't do infrastructure. It does, but it's just not the theme of the program. Those things happen, but what's driving it is a need for innovation. So when it comes to technology trends, 4 key areas we see in this. The Internet of Things. So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, being as we're at an IoTX event. Ubiquitous connectivity. Now, within the UAE and Dubai, we're doing very well in terms of connectivity, both in fixed and mobile networks, and Huawei is a key partner for operators to deliver both fiber to the home, FTTX across the UAE, and 4G connectivity. That enables a broad spectrum of connectivity possibilities with lowering prices all the time. As an example, a personal example, a year ago, roughly, I was paying about 100 dirhams a month for 100 megabytes of data. Now I'm paying 300 to 400 dirhams a month for 10 gigabytes plus of data. I barely managed to use 2, but what it really means is that I'm always connected, and I'm not looking for a Wi-Fi hotspot anymore. I don't need it. I can't use what I've got. But I'm now ready to be able to adopt all of the mobile services. So when we develop applications, and when the government departments create some great applications, but if you can't access them, the adoption rate is going to be low. So part of that is the ubiquitous connectivity. Open data. I'm going to talk a little bit about this as well later on, about the Internet of Things, and relating it to open data, and then M services. His Excellency Sheikh Mohammed, he talked about wanting every citizen to access government services through a mobile phone or smart device. What that means is when we talk about distributed government and accessing government services, that actually people don't want to go to a physical kiosk and interact through some video. My kiosk is in my hand. That's how we want to adopt services, and that's important to understand the technology trends. The other part of it is understanding people. And I use with people that I talk to the example of operators. If you see operators, both the 2 operators in the UAE doing this, have within the malls small kiosks. Because when you want to go to kiosk, you want to interact with someone. And this is part about distributed government. And Dubai is doing that very well in terms of deploying government offices in various districts. The next level I would suggest is to follow the operator example and deploy 2 or 3 person kiosks within malls and places like that. And the other is the people who want to adopt electronically can do it on their mobile phone. So, moving on. The Internet of Things. IDC, who I mentioned earlier, IDC put out a report just recently that the market for the Internet of Things is about $1.7 trillion by 2020. That will get all the vendors outside very excited in wanting to have a piece of that, including Huawei. But what does it really do for us? And how do we go forward with it? Again, a lot of discussion around M2M versus IoT. So here's a working hypothesis, we call it, so a way for us to understand the difference. And it's, this is a subject of great debate on blogs with great technical minds going into nth level of detail, but this is what I would put forward to you, is that the Internet of Things is generally seen as broader than M2M. M2M does what it says on the can, and it's about machines talking to other machines. The Internet of Things is born out of a vision of a convergence of the real and digital worlds. And what that means is we need to be able to connect to and sense more things, be it on our personal space or within the environment. Looking at the overall connectivity space for the Internet of Things, we break it down into three key categories. By the way, does anyone have an Audi vehicle? Anyone brave enough? Yes, okay. So I raised that because it was actually publicly announced in the last couple of weeks. Huawei is actually the official technology partner for Audi and also with Volkswagen. And at the top end of the spectrum of connectivity are applications that require high bandwidth, low latency, and are jitter sensitive. Things like driverless vehicles. And that's where Huawei is one of the leading vendors and innovators within 5G technology. 5G you might well have heard about. I guess we're all familiar with 2G, 3G, and we all have wonderful 4G across most of the UE. And 5G is coming next. And in fact, Huawei at IoTX last year demonstrated with Etisalat 5G in terms of remote operations and what it can do for us. Below that is what we term as the medium space. This is a lot of things that we can do today. And Dilip talked about a lot of connectivity. That's what's happening today. And outside on our booth, you'll see a lot of this also in terms of providing connectivity using existing technologies. And this is everything from telematics, and you'll see the onboard diagnostics chip outside for vehicle tracking, all the way through to smart metering and so on, using existing technologies of 2, 3, and 4G. Below that, there is an untapped market, really, of low power wide area, of connecting more things. But it's a bit like oil. If we think about data as oil, there's some oil that you can get to easily, and it's cost effective. And there's some oil, like shale oil maybe, requires a new way of approaching it. And it needs to be cost effective to do it. And this is what we term as the low power wide area space. And again, Huawei is one of the leading companies in this area and working on a standards-based approach for low power wide area. In fact, there's some very recent work with both Qualcomm, which you may be familiar with in terms of chip manufacturer, and other major telco communications, wireless communications suppliers who are working on standards-based approaches to addressing this market. And that is fundamentally important to be able to allow innovation in this space. Because what's holding it back is for sensor manufacturers to know which standard to build on. It's not cheap to do that. So once that's established that here's a standards-based, open way of doing it, then we believe that this whole market will flourish. And people will talk about 30 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion connected devices. They're all projections, right? All projections based on, hopefully, on some clarity of what the market might look like. But we believe a fundamental enabler to that is lowering the barrier of entry. So the cost of entry, and this comes out of some of the work that Huawei's been doing in this space. So how do we realize this future? Giving us high-speed connectivity, huge number of connections. When we talk about billions of devices, they've got to communicate somehow, and providing low latency. So here's the story. It was already announced that we believe that 4.5G technology will be bringing into this region by next year. It was announced at LTE MENA within Dubai just earlier this year. 4.5G is the roadmap to 5G. Fundamental to that is both the higher bandwidth and greater connections, but also the low power wide area space, which you'll see demonstrated on our booth outside, termed as LTM, otherwise known as cellular IoT. And this space, and this market, we believe is fundamental to address it in a standards-based open approach, following all the security protocols that LTE provides. We all use our phones today. We're very comfortable with our email and everything else, WhatsApp messages going over that. All of those security protocols are inherited into LTE-M, which makes it inherently secure. And also, when it comes to data, and I'll come on to the data part of it as well, is that we're now able to collate all of that data into a real data lake rather than data ponds, which we then need to be able to bring together. So just about 4.5G, we're actually starting to do trials within the region, even within the country, on 4.5G and LTE-M. What we're talking about is massive capacity, up to 1 gigabyte. Right now, when the operators are planning for connectivity, they're looking at about 1,000 connections per square kilometer or per base station. We see that as increasing to 100,000. That will really enable us to and I'll come on to the sensor manufacturers and the chipsets behind that, to allow people to develop new sensors and new ways to know what's going on around us, and then low latency as well. Again, I'll talk about what's been publicly announced, and this is something that we did with at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona earlier this year with Vodafone, public trials of LTE-M, based on an acquisition that we'd done of a company called Newell. Newell was working on a standard called Weightless, and the objectives of the Weightless SIG, or Special Interest Group, is about delivering sensors with a 10-year battery life. There's no point putting sensors around everywhere and then every 6 months you have to go change the battery. It's not effective, and it's not cost effective. 10-year battery life, a huge distance range, up to 10 or 20 kilometers range from a single base station, integrated into the existing infrastructure within a city. As the operators know, site acquisition is a challenge, especially in some places. But what we're talking about here is using the existing infrastructure and being able to enable LTE-M. So how do we move this forward? Later this year, we'll be announcing a cellular IoT alliance. Again, based on 3GPP, which is the standards body for cellular technologies. Within Release 13, I mentioned earlier that, again, companies like Huawei, Qualcomm, and others are working to standardize this low-power wide area space. And what will happen then is that we'll give the ecosystem a level playing field and a standards-based approach to know how to engage and how to develop sensors. Adding on to that, we announced within the last month something called Light OS. Light OS is the most lightweight OS in the world. It's 20% more energy efficient and 20% faster response than any other OS. What it will do is enable developers to focus on developing applications of IoT rather than having to worry about the technologies. And this is all open source. It's currently open source and available, and it will be put onto GitHub. Anyone who's familiar with GitHub will know it's an open source environment for developers and people who can make sensors focused on technology and the application of it rather than trying to make things talk together. So here's some of the features of Light OS. Self-discovery, DIY, so it's sensors talking to sensors without you having to really do very much. So it lowers the barrier for developers. That enables people like the guy sat outside at the hackathon to be able to, maybe even me with a little bit of training might be able to develop an application on it. So that was IoT. And now open data. And how do we use some of that data? So we see data in two distinct groups. I'll talk about open data a little bit because it's certainly a trend within smart cities and the industry overall. So cities are talking about how to use their data. Cities have a lot of important information and a lot of important data that can be put to use by the citizens. Again, that's hopefully what the hackathon people will be doing outside, and I'll be judging some of that later today. Here's an example of a simple but powerful use of open data. I think this is from Chicago, I believe. An app called PulsePoint. PulsePoint allows, for example, 911 calls. If a 911 call is made for a cardiac arrest, that data can be pushed to anyone within the region based on the operator's location-based knowledge, someone who's registered CPR practitioner. That CPR practitioner might only be 2 minutes away, whereas the ambulance might take an hour. So with a very simple but powerful application, you can really save people's lives. This is some data from Socrato about open government data. So what we can see is that there's a lot of innovation potential opened up by allowing open government data. Now, the data laws within each country, and by the way, we were discussing this within the ITU about how we should address open government data. What we concluded basically was that from a standards perspective, everything should be open, and it's up to the laws within the country to apply their open data laws. And that's exactly what Dubai is doing now, is working on an open data law to restrict, so you can decide what's open and what's not. Here's an example from the operator's side. Again, you'll see some demonstration of big data outside and its use in city management. It's a real case from China Unicom about using mobile data, subscriber data, anonymized of course, for monetization. So based on the footfall of users in a certain area, you can know where the most, or you can price band different locations for outdoor advertising, for example, or where to build your next mall. And this data is, if you're familiar with Nielsen, does a lot of market research on retail. This allows companies to use that data in an effective way and monetize it. But we believe the real power comes from being able to combine these two forms of data, the operator's capabilities and their knowledge of data, and also open government data. So how do we do that? Here's something we call the Urban Innovation Platform concept, which we put together. Was, on the one hand, there's the sensing layer. From an IoT perspective, it's very high level. Right? ICT infrastructure which exists to be able to transport and process that data. And then you have government data. So if I was thinking about a country level, every city may well have its own data and different departments that have data. But from an operator's perspective, the ability to aggregate all that, and even from the country perspective, to aggregate that into some form of open collaboration and interface that with the operator's capabilities. Operators have data both on the fixed and the mobile network. Again, we're talking about anonymized data, and whatever the data laws and security laws are within the country to be applied into creating an IDE or an integrated developer environment. Again, that's probably, hopefully, what the hackers are doing outside, is using these different forms of data and creating that platform for innovation. That platform where people can create apps. Part of the city management demonstration that we're doing outside is using some of that, called AEP, which is about application interfaces and how we do that within Huawei. So, creating success. Very quick example about something we've done with China Mobile. And by the way, I was a few months ago in one of those cities called Hangzhou in China. I sat in a coffee shop with one of my local colleagues there, and we pulled out his smartphone. I looked through a bunch of apps that were available from China Mobile, and I said, well, let me take a look at the CCTV cameras across the city. Now, not all of them are available, just the ones that are known to be public. And I sat there and I picked a certain junction and I want to see the live feed from there. And I was watching the live feed of traffic on my phone, sat in a coffee shop. Wouldn't it be great if I could do that before I left the office instead of sitting in traffic for 10 minutes when I get around the corner? And the scale is huge. Now, as Huawei, we're just one of the vendors within this domain. There are many, and there are many different people who should and could be engaged within creating a smarter city program. Our strategy, and we believe, is certainly to support the operators within the region. We believe that the operators are key partners of the government, but hardware vendors like ourselves, there's others who are software vendors and consultants, all are part of that ecosystem. And we play within that domain. But all of that is required in order to create a better tomorrow. Just some snapshots of what Huawei is doing. Huawei is listed in the Thomson Reuters top 100 innovators. Last year, Huawei's revenue was about 46.5 billion. 14% of that is spent in R&D. That allows us to do many things and innovate many things. For example, 5G. Where we're investing at least 600 million into that. Partnership with JCDecaux. JCDecaux, one of the biggest outdoor marketing companies in the world, and integrating our technology into street furniture. I mentioned our involvement with the ITU and the standards bodies around that, and the acquisition of Newell, which has provided us a spur to develop some of the low-power wide area space. My time's running short. Okay, so that was all from me, and thank you very much.